On any given day, we communicate with people we don't know or don't know well. Those interactions can be fraught with misunderstandings and misreading. Author and podcaster Malcolm Gladwell has taken this idea and run with it in his first book in 6 years. It's called Talking to Strangers, What We Should Know About the People We Don't Know. And it brings him to our studio tonight. We are delighted to welcome the pride of Southwestern Ontario back to TVO.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here.
Yeah, my
You want to take a second and just sort of remind people you used to live here?
I grew up in Elmira, Ontario. My dad taught at the University of Waterloo. My family all lives still in Waterloo. I'm a local. I've returned home here.
I was going to say we take a certain amount of pride in your success, so well done. This book, I have to tell you, is such a fresh look at how we size people up that we don't know and how our first impressions may be far more valuable than actually talking to somebody for 3 or 4 or 5 hours. Where did you get the notion that there was a lot more to learn about this than what was currently understood?
Well, I began looking at a series of high-profile cases that what were the things that we were kind of obsessed with in our society? And I looked at, if you look at the Bernie Madoff case, where a large group of investors were willing to entrust millions and billions, in fact, of dollars to someone who they thought they knew, but in fact they didn't. And then there was the Jerry Sandusky case at Penn State, where people worked with a man who was a football coach. He was beloved, and then they discovered, 20 years later, that he was a pedophile. I mean, I could go on. Each one, the story that I structure my book around, the story of Sandra Bland, is she was a young woman pulled over by a police officer, and for some trivial reason, they get into an argument. He ends up dragging her out of the car. She commits suicide in her cell. And if you look at millions of people have watched that encounter because it was videotaped on the officer's dash cam. If you listen to the videotape, it's just an epic misunderstanding between...
On both sides?
On both sides, largely on the police officer's side. But so I just began to think, is there something about the world we live in now that makes these kinds of misunderstandings stand out and are we doing something wrong? Is the modern world asking us to do something that we're simply not adept at doing? And so that's where the book comes from.
How many times do you think you've watched the video of Sandra Bland being arrested by that officer?
I mean, 25, 30 times. I mean, so many times. I mean, in the book, sort of breaks down that encounter in very, very close. I do a close reading of it, as they say.
You go through chapter and verse of it, line by line by line, and you really show how the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah.
But if you're living it at the moment, could either of the two of them have interrupted what appeared to be an inexorable flow towards tragedy by just doing one thing differently at one key moment?
Well, at the end of the book, I sort of conclude no. I think the only way to have prevented that sort of epic misunderstanding was to have a system that where police officers don't stop people for trivial reasons in the middle of the day. In other words, don't enter into a situation where the risk of misunderstanding is too high. The reasons why human beings misunderstand each other are pretty kind of hardwired into the way we make sense of the world. That's one of the kind of arguments of the book, that the very things that make us good at interacting with people who we love and who are intimate with us, who are family members or something, make it hard for us to deal with people who are outside of our kind of intimate circle. And they're pretty formidable obstacles. And so I think we have to restructure our world around this vulnerability. There's no way to send police officers, I mean, you could try, but I don't think you can send police officers or job interviewers or judges or interviewers of TV shows to some kind of school where they can learn to do better with strangers. That strikes me as being a tall order.
I spend a lot of my time talking to politicians. And one of the things I found interesting about your book is that you think that most of the interactions, the vast majority of interactions that happen among people in our world, are actually people telling the truth to each other. And of course, I'm in a job where I've been told that virtually every interaction I'm going to have with a politician will start with, if not an outright lie, then at least a kind of a fudging of the truth in order to get their side forward. Have I been doing it wrong all these years? I should be defaulting to truth?
Well, this is an idea that I explore at length in the book, is this notion that we evolved as trusting machines, human beings do. The reason we've managed to build the society we have is that we implicitly believe what we're told. It takes a lot to sort of shake us out of our default to truth. And that's why we're so easily deceived by people like Bernie Madoff or people who are trying to pull the wool over our eyes. But the premise of that idea is that it's a good strategy because most people are telling the truth, and that lies are told by a very small number of people, real sort of serious, malicious lies.
How do we know that, actually?
Well, this is something that, there's a group of psychologists who study this, who spend a lot of time trying to kind of figure that out. And, huge numbers of surveys, analyses of recorded speech. I mean, there's only many ways to look at it. And when you do look at it, the number of consequential lies that you or I tell in the course of a given day is very small. There's just no reason. Most of the time we realize that to tell a lie, a real one, not a white lie, what did you have for lunch? And you omit the chocolate bar because you're slightly ashamed of that. That's not a lie. Like, a lie is where you go home and you tell your wife that some preposterous fiction. You say you were here when you were in fact miles away. That's a lie. Most of us recognize that telling a lie creates more trouble than it's worth, right? We don't. And even it's one of the things you learn as a child, which is to tell a bald-faced lie is just an invitation to trouble. So the number of you really have to have a strong motivation to tell a whopper. And so once you realize that only small numbers of people tell whoppers, then you realize actually it's not a bad strategy just to believe everything. So when you mentioned politicians, I would dispute that politicians lie a lot. I actually think what they do is they may carefully omit certain facts, or they may give you a generous reading of their own position, or they act as the home crowd does in a hockey game. A penalty happens on the ice that goes against your team, and you boo lustily because you're just not willing to admit that penalty is right. But is that deliberate deception? No, I don't think so.
Do you have any additional difficulty making that argument at this particular moment in this particular country, where the two leaders of the two main political parties have just both been kind of hoist on their petard? One dramatically awful example with Justin Trudeau's blackface, brownface.
Yeah.
But even Andrew Scheer, the leader of the Conservative parties, having been outed in the last few days as having sort of fudged his resume a little bit.
Yeah. I would put that in the category of those two things in the category of, I wouldn't call those highly consequential deceptions. A consequential deception is a pedophile pretending to be a upstanding member of the community, or Bernie Madoff pretending to invest people's money when in fact he is constructing everything out of whole cloth. A lie is Adolf Hitler saying, I have no intentions of invading any countries in Europe in 1938. Those are lies. And I think one of the things that we do to our peril is to confuse the kind of everyday shading of the truth, which, all right, that's just part of the way society works, with these kinds of really troubling, devastating deceptions. In the book, I tell a number of spy stories about trying to answer the question is, how is it that over and over and over again, very, very sophisticated spy services get deceived by double agents? A double agent is someone who is telling a profound lie. They are pretending to be X and they are Y, right? That's really what I'm focused on, the concept, why it's so hard to tell when that kind of a lie is being told.
I do want to follow up on the Hitler thing, because that is really quite... William Lyon Mackenzie King, Canada's Prime Minister, before World War II broke out, went in 1937 to Berlin, had a meeting with Hitler. They continued to be in touch after that meeting was over. He certainly felt he had an understanding of the man.
Yeah.
Neville Chamberlain, of course, with a very famous series of meetings with Adolf Hitler. You would think all of that personal contact would have counted for something. Winston Churchill, who never met Hitler, certainly understood him way better than either of those two men.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Yeah, so that I have a whole chapter on the on the Neville Chamberlain. That's the great paradox, of course, that the people who met Hitler prior to the Second World War tended to be the ones who had the most difficulty seeing Hitler for who he really was. Those who understood Hitler to be the monster he was were the ones who never met him. Churchill, to my astonishment, I thought he had. Churchill never met Hitler. Stalin never met Hitler. FDR never met Hitler. Those who did meet him, like William Mackenzie King and like Neville Chamberlain, fell under his spell and did not perceive him for who he really is. And that chapter is all about this notion that it is not the case that meeting someone face to face necessarily gives you greater insight into their true intentions. In many cases, the opposite can happen. It is not the case, for example, that a judge who meets a defendant can do a better job of correctly determining whether the defendant deserves bail than someone who doesn't meet the defendant. There's nothing, the kind of information that you're gathering in that sort of brief encounter, or Neville Chamberlain having coffee with Adolf Hitler, the information he gathers is not that useful. In fact, it may be harmful. That's very unsettling. It is. It suggests, and this is a personal crusade of mine, that many job interviews are a bad idea. In other words, it's not a bad idea to find out about the person you're hiring. It may be a bad idea to meet the person that you're hiring, because what exactly is the value of the face-to-face encounter? We need to really sort of probe into that, because it may be that everything we're gathering from that is irrelevant to the task of deciding someone's fitness for a job. Well, I think you go further. The famous Amanda Knox case in Italy, where she apparently didn't behave the way that we expect a person who is under the, in the crosshairs of guilt ought to behave, and as a result, went to jail. Yeah, she was, if you remember, people remember that case. This was a staple in the tabloid headlines for years around the world. Young American woman who moves to Italy and for her a year abroad and is falsely accused of murdering her roommate. And there literally was no physical evidence linking her to the crime. Without a shadow of doubt in retrospect, she was innocent. Yet people were convinced she was guilty, largely because her behavior in the wake of her roommate's death did not match people's kind of stereotype about the way someone who was grieving ought to behave. Mm-hmm. And on the basis of that completely erroneous inference from someone else's behavior, people leapt to the conclusion she must be guilty. And she spent 4 years in an Italian prison. It's a really striking example about how truly terrible we can be at reading a stranger. But that's the unsettling part of all of this, is that I would assume after 59 years of watching people, talking to people, picking up on their cues, that I have some sense about what they're, and you're shaking your head already. No, you don't. I don't, do I? No, do I. I'm in the same business as you. We do this for a living, right? I've been talking to strangers for 35 years as a journalist, and I can say now with absolute certainty that I am probably no better at it today than I was when I started. I may think I'm better, but almost certainly I am not. Let me take you to college and university campuses. Mm-hmm. You have, again, a very unsettling story in the book about what can happen when students get drunk, never mind the loss of inhibitions when you have too much alcohol, but so much more beyond that you also discovered, for example. Yeah. So this was a case that was, I don't know whether it made headlines up here, but it was a huge case in the United States 2 years ago. A young man on the Stanford campus was convicted of sexually assaulting a young woman. And it was after a fraternity party late on a Saturday night. And both people in this incident, in this episode, were very, very drunk. So the woman was blackout drunk. She was so drunk that her hippocampus had shut down. And the guy was like twice the legal limit. And it turns out that if you look at campus sexual assaults, which are across North America rising at epidemic rates, you will discover that is overwhelmingly the pattern, that almost always they take place in the presence of severe inebriation on one or both of the parties, typically both of the parties. And yet when you look at discussion of campus sexual assault, alcohol is very often absent from the discussion. I wanted to do a chapter, since I was writing a book about miscommunication. I thought, well, campus sexual assaults might be a good situation to analyze. So I went around talking to people who study them, and every single one of those researchers who study this epidemic problem, the first thing out of their mouth was, well, you're going to talk about alcohol, aren't you? I was like, I hadn't intended to. And they're like, well, these things are about alcohol. You can't discuss sexual assault without taking that into account. And so that's what the chapter's about. It's about, under the best of circumstances, communication between two young people is going to be difficult, right? They're immature, they don't know the rules, they're trying to work out something that's sexual consent is an extraordinarily complicated issue under the best of circumstances. What happens when I add huge amounts of alcohol to the mix? And I explore in that chapter this kind of new theory of inebriation called the myopia theory, which says that what drunkenness is doing is not revealing your true self. It's not that it strips away all the things that kind of hide my true intentions. It does the opposite. That what it does is it shuts down all of my higher cognitive processes and makes me someone who is at the mercy of what is going on in the moment directly in front of me. I am myopic. And when you are myopic, you are not yourself, right? Our normal selves, the reason we are human is that we are not myopic. We are capable of thinking an hour ahead, a day ahead, a month ahead, a year ahead, I mean, on and on and on. The reason I'm not, the reason I don't get up angrily and walk out of the studio, even if I might want to, suppose you insulted me and something, right? I don't do that because I realize, oh, that's gonna look really bad when this airs on Friday, right? So all of us as human beings are thinking ahead. That's taken away when we're drunk. So when you get two teenagers who are drunk out of their minds, trying to negotiate matters of consent, they are not negotiating as their true selves. They are negotiating as some kind of shrunken version of themselves. And that's why sexual assault is so problematic, because you wake up in the morning and you realize that something happened that you had no intention of happening.
And chances are you may not even remember.
And chances are you may not even remember.
Should we ban drugs and alcohol on campus in order to reduce the numbers of sexual assaults?
No, I think that's probably going too far, and just will drive drugs and alcohol underground. But I went to college, a mile from here, University of Toronto, and the drinking patterns there were very different from the drinking patterns on today's. This was many years ago. I'm an old man.
You're younger than me, young fella.
I am very young. That does not make me young.
Ouch.
No. I mean, it would be one thing if you were 31 and I was 28. So I think we need to moderate it. So when I was on campus, we drank beer almost overwhelmingly. It is very, very hard to get blackout drunk on beer, right? In fact, virtually impossible. Today, they're drinking hard liquor. That's one problem. Second problem is that when I was on college campuses, women did not match men drink for drink. Today, they do overwhelmingly, and that is physiologically catastrophic because women are smaller and process alcohol very differently than men. And the third thing is there was a lot of supervision at our parties, and there seems to be much less, particularly on American college campuses, much less adult supervision. And you must have adult supervision. I mean, the case I was describing was at Stanford University. Stanford University has an endowment of $30 billion. They can afford to have a sober adult, just walking around and observing at a Friday night, Saturday night party. They don't. That just seems to me the height of foolishness. That says to me that they aren't taking the problem of drunkenness seriously, right? They have to understand that if you have 19-year-olds who have, 0.24 alcohol in their blood alcohol levels.
3 times the legal limit.
3 times the legal limit. You'd better have someone walking around the party just making sure those people don't do something profoundly stupid.
I want to set up this next question by reading an excerpt from the book. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring the graphic up. The transparency problem ends up in the same place as the default to truth problem. We have strategies for dealing with strangers that are deeply flawed, but they are also socially necessary. We need the criminal justice system and the hiring process and the selection of babysitters to be human. But the requirement of humanity means that we have to tolerate an enormous amount of error. That is the paradox of talking to strangers. We need to talk to them, but we're terrible at it. And we're not always honest with each other about just how terrible at it we are.
Yes.
Thus, what do we do?
Well, I think we have to, there's no simple answer, first of all. In the end of the book, what I say is we need to be cautious and humble in our ability to make sense of strangers. We need to moderate certain kinds of, I spend the last quarter of the book talking about what does policing look like in an urban area if you understand that it's very, very difficult for a police officer to make sense of a civilian when they stop them after, in a traffic stop or stop them when they're walking down the street. So there are ways to kind of alter our institutional practices to account for how bad we are at this. Another way might be, when I hire people now, I hired my current assistant and I made her remove the names of all of the institutions she attended on her resume. And then I didn't meet her. I Skyped with her, but I deliberately didn't meet her face-to-face.
Because?
Because I was worried that any information I gathered from meeting her face-to-face would be irrelevant. More than irrelevant, it would be harmful to my ability to make an accurate assessment of her. Why does it matter whether she's tall or short, whether her hair is blonde or black, how she dresses, whether she has a massive tattoo on her arm or not? Those are the kinds of things I would gather from a face-to-face encounter. They're all irrelevant to my task of...
Couldn't you pick up a tell if she were fudging some information better if you were this close to her?
I don't believe that people reliably give tells, and nor do I have any confidence in my ability to pick up on them, even if they did. So that was a case where, in future, I intend to do this entirely on email. I don't think I should meet them at all.
You don't, not even look at them on Skype?
No, I think that was a mistake, actually. I regret Skyping with her. Huh. And she would agree with this. She would say, what? Her job, if I made a list of all the things she has to do in her job, by the way, she's very good at it, but none of them are things that I could have gathered from a face-to-face encounter. She needs to be conscientious, hardworking. She needs to be a self-starter. She needs to be incredibly diligent. She can't make mistakes. She has to think for me. She needs to work well remotely because I'm not around a lot. Tell me, of those traits I've just given you, are any of them the kinds of things that you can uniquely pick up from a face-to-face encounter? One
thing you could pick up from a face-to-face encounter is, am I going to get along with this person?
That's actually at the bottom of my list. I don't need to get it. As it happens, I get along with her. But I think most of us get along with, if someone is diligent and hardworking, I think we always get along with you. I've never not gotten along with someone who was a conscientious, hardworking person.
Do you think we're getting along okay right now?
I think we're doing very well.
Because we have this face-to-face connection.
No, but I would get along with you if this was on the phone.
That's terrific. You know what? We're plumb out of time, so you're going to have to come back because we're going to talk about podcasting next time, and we're going to talk about how you get your ideas next time, and we're going to talk about why you're so damn good next time. But for this time, this has been Talking to Strangers with Malcolm Gladwell, and we're delighted that you could make some time for us at TVO tonight.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.